Oakland, California, 1964. In the private training facility of Bruce Lee's Junfan Kung Fu Institute. Bruce Lee, already controversial in the martial arts community, was about to demonstrate a technique so dangerous that it would be banned from public teaching for decades. The documentation captured that day remained locked in vault storage for over 50 years, because those who witnessed that technique knew this wasn't just another self-defense move or flashy demonstration. This was real. This was lethal. This was Bruce Lee revealing a strike that could kill with surgical precision. What you're about to hear is a story that only a handful of people alive today can confirm. A story about a technique so devastating it was deliberately suppressed. A story about power, responsibility, and knowledge that Bruce feared would be misused. Yet if those training records hadn't been meticulously documented, this technique would have died with Bruce Lee forever. Some say it was the strike that made even his closest students afraid of him. Others claim it was the moment martial arts lost its most dangerous weapon. But one thing is certain. What Bruce Lee demonstrated in that Oakland facility on that October afternoon would remain a closely guarded secret for over 5 decades. This is that story. The year was 1964, and Bruce Lee was at a crossroads. He had opened his Junfan Kung Fu Institute in Oakland after leaving Seattle, building a small but dedicated group of students who were willing to train in his revolutionary approach to martial arts. He had married Linda, started a family, and was developing Jeet Kune Do systematically. What he had proven his philosophy worked in demonstrations and private challenge matches, but the traditional martial arts community viewed him with suspicion and hostility. The Chinese martial arts establishment especially saw him as a traitor. He was teaching kung fu to non-Chinese students, violating centuries of tradition. He was openly criticizing classical styles as too rigid and outdated. He was claiming his hybrid approach was superior to time-tested methods. And so, Bruce found himself constantly defending his methods, explaining his philosophy, proving that innovation didn't mean disrespect. But there was one technique he'd developed that he didn't demonstrate publicly, that he taught to only his most trusted students, that he documented but then deliberately suppressed. The Oakland training facility was modest and functional. Not the elaborate commercial dojos that dominated American martial arts, but a simple space with hardwood floors, heavy bags, wooden dummies, and minimal decoration. This was where serious training happened, where students came not for belts or certificates, but for authentic combat knowledge. If you're watching this story and learning about Bruce Lee's banned technique, the strike so dangerous it was suppressed for 50 years, hit that subscribe button right now, because this is the kind of secret knowledge that reveals Bruce Lee's most lethal capabilities, the techniques he deliberately kept hidden from public view. Among Bruce's students was a man named James Yim Lee, no relation but a close friend and training partner. James was older than Bruce, already an accomplished martial artist and author, and had become Bruce's most trusted confidant in developing and documenting Jeet Kune Do techniques. James kept meticulous training records, photographing techniques, writing detailed descriptions, creating archives that would preserve Bruce's methods for future generations. On an October afternoon in 1964, Bruce called a special training session. Not the regular class, but a private gathering of only his 5 most advanced students. James Yim Lee, Dan Inosanto, who'd recently started training, Taki Kimura, who'd come from Seattle, and 2 other dedicated practitioners whose names would remain confidential. Bruce had something to show them, something he'd been developing in private, something he'd tested only on himself through careful anatomical study and controlled application. The 5 students gathered in the training facility. On sensing this was different from normal sessions. Bruce's demeanor was unusually serious, almost grave. "What I'm about to demonstrate," Bruce began, "is a technique I've developed through studying human anatomy, nerve clusters, and biomechanical vulnerabilities. It's devastatingly effective, potentially lethal. And I'm documenting it today because this knowledge shouldn't die with me, but I'm also making a decision about this technique that I need you to understand and honor." The students exchanged glances, their curiosity mixing with concern. They'd trained with Bruce long enough to recognize when he was genuinely worried about something. "This technique," Bruce continued, "targets the vagus nerve at a specific angle and with specific force. The vagus nerve controls heart rate, breathing, and blood pressure. A precise strike to this nerve cluster can cause immediate cardiac arrest. Not might cause. Will cause, if executed correctly. The room went silent. This wasn't self-defense. This was a killing technique. Bruce walked to the anatomical diagram he'd mounted on the wall, a detailed illustration of the human neck showing nerve pathways, arteries, and vulnerable points. He pointed to a specific location on the diagram. "Here," Bruce said, touching a point just below the ear, behind the jaw. "This is where the vagus nerve is most accessible. Protected by muscle in most people, but vulnerable to a precisely angled strike that penetrates between muscle fibers without damaging them. And if you're enjoying this revelation about Bruce Lee's most dangerous knowledge, if you're learning techniques that were deliberately banned from public teaching, I'd hit that like button because it helps preserve these true accounts of what Bruce Lee actually developed beyond what movies ever showed." The strike itself, Bruce continued, uses a ridge hand formation with the hand. Not a fist, not an open palm, but the ridge between the index and middle finger metacarpals. This creates a narrow striking surface that can penetrate between muscle fibers. The angle of attack is approximately 45 degrees upward and inward, following the path of least resistance through the sternocleidomastoid muscle to reach the nerve cluster behind it. James Yim Lee was taking notes furiously, documenting every detail, while another student photographed the diagram and Bruce's hand positioning. "The force required isn't massive," Bruce explained. "In fact, too much force defeats the purpose. It's about precision, angle, and striking the exact point where the nerve is most vulnerable. Approximately 60 pounds of focused pressure, delivered in a sharp pulse rather than sustained pressure." He demonstrated the hand formation, showing how the ridge of his hand created a narrow striking surface. Then he demonstrated the motion, not on a person, but on a heavy bag, showing the 45-degree angle, the penetrating motion, the sharp pulse of energy. "This is what makes it so dangerous," Bruce said. "It doesn't look devastating, doesn't require obvious power. Someone watching might not even realize what happened. The target appears to have fainted or had a heart attack. But it was deliberate, calculated, murder disguised as natural causes." The students were silent, absorbing the implications of what Bruce was teaching. This wasn't martial arts for self-defense or sport. See, this was assassination technique. Taki Kimura finally spoke. "Sifu, why are you showing us this? If it's this dangerous, why document it at all?" Bruce's answer was thoughtful and measured. "Because knowledge shouldn't die. Because martial arts effectiveness includes understanding the most dangerous techniques, even if we choose never to use them. Because students need to know these vulnerabilities exist, to understand how to defend against them, to recognize when they're being targeted. But here's my decision about this technique." He looked at each student in turn, making sure they understood the seriousness of what came next. "I'm documenting this strike completely. James will photograph it, write detailed instructions, create a technical manual that explains every aspect of its application. But that manual will be sealed. See, marked as forbidden knowledge. It will not be taught in regular classes. It will not be demonstrated publicly. It will remain archived as part of Jeet Kune Do's complete technical library, but access will be restricted to senior instructors only, and only for understanding, not for teaching." If you've made it this far in the story, if you're still engaged in learning about Bruce Lee's most dangerous secret, leave a comment below telling me what you think about this banned technique. Should knowledge this lethal be documented at all? Should it be sealed forever or eventually released? I read every comment and want to know your perspective on forbidden martial arts knowledge. Dan Inosanto asked the question they were all thinking. "Sifu, have you tested this technique? On a person?" Bruce's answer was quiet, but clear. "Wardy, I've tested it on myself. Carefully, with precise control. I've located the exact point on my own neck, applied pressure gradually to understand the sensation, the threshold where the vagus nerve begins to respond. I felt the beginning of the effect, the heart rate disruption, the breathing difficulty, and I've stopped before causing damage. That's how I know it works. That's how I know the specifications are accurate." The implications of that statement settled over the room. Bruce had been willing to risk his own life to understand this technique, to test its effectiveness, to ensure the documentation was accurate. That was the level of his dedication to knowledge, even dangerous knowledge. Over the next 2 hours, Bruce demonstrated every aspect of the technique: the exact hand formation, the precise angle of attack, the penetration depth required, the force measurement, the timing and rhythm of the strike, the warning signs that it was working, the emergency reversal if applied accidentally. James Yim Lee documented everything: photographs from multiple angles, written descriptions with anatomical terminology, diagrams showing force vectors and angles, a complete technical manual that would allow someone with sufficient anatomical knowledge to understand and potentially replicate the technique. But Bruce also demonstrated the defenses: how to position your neck to protect the vulnerable point, how to recognize when someone was setting up for this specific strike, how to abort the technique if you realized mid-execution that it was going too far, how to potentially reverse the cardiac arrest if administered within seconds of application. See, when the session ended, Bruce gathered all the documentation, the photographs, the written descriptions, the diagrams, and placed them in a sealed envelope. He wrote on the outside in careful handwriting: "Vagus nerve strike, forbidden technique, lethal application, do not teach, archive only." Before we continue with what happened to this documentation, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button one more time if you haven't already, because Bruce Lee's story contains forbidden knowledge like this, techniques deliberately banned because they were too dangerous, true accounts of what he developed in private beyond public martial arts. He looked at his 5 students. You've witnessed this technique. You understand its application. You could, if you chose, use this knowledge. That makes you responsible for it. I'm trusting you to honor the restriction I've placed on it. Not because the knowledge is shameful, but because it's too dangerous in the wrong hands. They all nodded, understanding the weight of what they'd learned. James took the sealed envelope and locked it in the vault where he kept all of Bruce's technical documentation, training records, and private notes. That technique would not be taught again during Bruce's lifetime. Word of the banned technique spread through Bruce's student network, but only in whispers and rumors. People knew Bruce had developed something he considered too dangerous to teach. They knew James Yim Lee had documentation locked away. But nobody knew the specifics except the 5 students who'd witnessed that October session. When Bruce died in 1973, but James Yim Lee made a decision about the forbidden technique documentation. He didn't destroy it because Bruce had wanted the knowledge preserved, but he didn't release it because Bruce had wanted it restricted. He transferred it to a bank vault, along with other sensitive Bruce Lee materials, with instructions that it should remain sealed for at least 50 years after Bruce's death, giving time for the world to mature, for martial arts to evolve, for the context to change enough that the technique could be understood responsibly. The technique became legend among Bruce Lee's students and their students: the forbidden strike, the killing technique Bruce banned from teaching, the knowledge so dangerous he'd sealed it away. Speculation ran wild about what it was, how it worked, whether it was really as lethal as the stories claimed. One day in 2023, 50 years after Bruce's death, the Bruce Lee Foundation faced a decision. The sealed documentation was reaching the end of its mandated restriction period. Should it be released, destroyed, kept sealed indefinitely? The debate was fierce. Some argued that knowledge should never be suppressed, that Bruce's complete technical library should be available for study. Others insisted that a killing technique had no place in modern martial arts, that releasing it would violate the spirit of Bruce's restriction. And, if you're still watching this story, if you're learning about the debate over Bruce Lee's banned technique, hit that like button one more time, because engagement helps preserve these accounts of forbidden martial arts knowledge that most people never learn exists. Finally, a compromise was reached. The documentation would be released, but with extensive context, warnings, and restrictions. It would be made available only to certified martial arts instructors with verified credentials. It would be accompanied by Bruce's own statements about why he'd banned it from teaching. It would include medical information about the risks and legal consequences of its application. When the vagus nerve strike documentation was finally released in late 2023, the martial arts community's response was divided and intense. Those who saw the detailed technical manual, the photographs of Bruce demonstrating the strike, the anatomical diagrams showing the exact targeting, they understood immediately why he'd banned it. This wasn't a self-defense technique, this was an assassination method. See, medical experts consulted about the documentation confirmed that, yes, a strike applied exactly as Bruce described, with the specified angle and force to the documented point, would very likely cause immediate cardiac arrest through vagus nerve disruption. That Bruce's anatomical understanding was accurate. That the technique, if executed properly, would be devastatingly effective and extremely difficult to defend against. The comment sections and martial arts forums exploded with debate. This knowledge should have stayed buried forever. There's no legitimate reason to teach a killing technique in modern martial arts. No, this proves Bruce Lee understood combat at a level beyond anyone else. He developed techniques that actually worked at the lethal level, then had the integrity to ban them from teaching. I've been studying martial arts for 30 years, and this documentation shows me that Bruce was operating on a completely different level from every other martial artist. He understood human anatomy like a surgeon. If you've made it this far, if this banned technique has completely changed your understanding of Bruce Lee's knowledge, leave one more comment telling me whether you think this documentation should have been released or stayed sealed forever. Your perspective matters to this conversation about forbidden martial arts knowledge. Dan Inosanto, now in his 80s, was interviewed about witnessing the technique in 1964. I was there that October afternoon when Bruce demonstrated it, he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. I saw him explain exactly how to kill someone with a single precise strike, and I understood why he immediately banned it from teaching. Bruce wasn't afraid of the technique itself. He was afraid of students learning it without the maturity to understand the responsibility it carried. The interviewer asked if Dan had ever used the technique. His answer was immediate and firm. Never. Not once in 60 years of martial arts practice. Not in self-defense situations, not in demonstrations, never. Because Bruce made us promise that this knowledge was for understanding, not application. For recognizing vulnerability, not exploiting it. And I've honored that promise. Taki Kimura, another of the 5 original witnesses, gave similar testimony before his death. He described the seriousness of that October session, the way Bruce had emphasized responsibility over capability, but the understanding that some knowledge carried moral weight that transcended technical effectiveness. The Bruce Lee Foundation created educational materials around the banned technique, using it as a case study in martial arts ethics. The materials asked important questions. Should lethal techniques be documented at all? If documented, who should have access? What responsibility do instructors have when teaching dangerous knowledge? How do we balance preservation of martial arts history with public safety? Perhaps most remarkably, the release of the vagus nerve strike documentation fulfilled Bruce Lee's original dual purpose. The knowledge was preserved, ensuring it wouldn't die with him, maintaining the complete technical record of what he'd developed. But it was also restricted, kept from casual access, or released only with context and warnings that emphasized its nature as forbidden knowledge meant for understanding rather than application. Before we finish this story, I need to ask one final favor. If this revelation about Bruce Lee's banned technique changed your understanding of his knowledge, if you learned about forbidden martial arts that were deliberately suppressed for 50 years, please share this video. Send it to martial artists who think they know everything Bruce developed. Send it to people who study Jeet Kune Do. Sharing helps preserve the complete truth about Bruce Lee's capabilities, including the techniques he chose to ban. As Bruce himself had written in the original documentation, preserved in his own handwriting. This technique represents the ultimate application of anatomical knowledge to combat. It works. It's efficient, it's precise, and it should never be taught casually or publicly. I'm documenting it because knowledge shouldn't die, but I'm banning it from teaching because some knowledge is too dangerous to spread widely. Future instructors who access this documentation must understand. Capability without responsibility is not martial arts, it's murder. The martial arts world continues debating the ethics of the vagus nerve strikes release. Some schools have incorporated the documentation into their advanced instructor training, using it as Bruce intended for understanding vulnerabilities and defensive awareness. Others have refused to acknowledge it, maintaining that some techniques should stay buried regardless of historical significance. As medical professionals who've studied the documentation note that awareness of this vulnerability could actually save lives, allowing doctors and emergency responders to recognize and potentially reverse vagus nerve disruption if they understand the mechanism Bruce documented. Legal experts point out that anyone using this technique would face murder charges, that the level of anatomical knowledge required proves premeditation, that Bruce's documentation itself demonstrates the killing was intentional rather than accidental. The technique remains banned from public teaching in every legitimate Jeet Kune Do organization. Instructors who've accessed the documentation are required to sign agreements acknowledging they understand its lethal nature, that they will not teach it to students, and that they access it only for understanding defensive vulnerabilities and historical completeness. Hit that subscribe button one final time if you haven't already, because this is exactly why we preserve these stories. Bruce Lee's legacy isn't just about the movies or the philosophy or the techniques he publicly taught. It's about the complete picture, including the knowledge he developed but deliberately banned because he understood that capability must be balanced with responsibility. In the end, the story of Bruce Lee's banned technique isn't really about a killing strike. It's about integrity, about a martial artist who developed something devastatingly effective, documented it completely, then immediately restricted it because he understood the moral weight of lethal knowledge. It's about choosing to preserve information while simultaneously preventing its misuse, about trusting future generations to handle dangerous knowledge responsibly. If that training session hadn't been documented, the vagus nerve strike would have died with Bruce Lee in 1973. The world would never have known he'd developed a technique capable of causing cardiac arrest through precise nerve disruption. Martial arts would have lost part of its most dangerous technical knowledge, but Bruce chose to document it completely while banning it from teaching. James Yim Lee honored that restriction by sealing it for 50 years. And now the complete documentation is available with all the context and warnings Bruce intended, proving that martial arts knowledge can be both preserved and protected. When Bruce Lee demonstrated his banned technique, that he revealed anatomical understanding that surpassed most medical professionals, developed a strike that could kill with surgical precision, then immediately suppressed it because he valued responsibility over reputation. The documentation proves the legend was built on complete knowledge, including the techniques too dangerous to teach. And the 50-year seal proves that some knowledge carries moral weight that transcends technical effectiveness. Martial arts would lose it forever, but Bruce ensured it survived, documented but restricted, preserved but protected, a testament to the principle that true mastery includes knowing when not to teach what you know.